Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of the 2023-2024 EMOS Webinars program. My name is Caterina Giusti. I'm Professor of Statistics at the University of Pisa in Italy. As a member of the EMOS team of my university, I'm working at the organization of this webinar program on behalf of Eurostat, together with the German company Startup. Today, I will act as the webinar moderator. Now, let me first explain for any newcomers that EMOS stands for the European Master in Official Statistics, a joint project of universities and data producers in the EU member states, EFTA, and EU candidate countries. If your university is interested in applying for the EMOS label, please consider that a permanently open call for universities is available on the EMOS dedicated page on the Eurostat website. For staying in contact with the EMOS community and news and community, please follow the EMOS on Twitter or X. The handle is @EU_EMOS. It's now time to start with our webinar. Before I give the floor to our speaker, let me first briefly explain how we run the webinar today. As you can see, and maybe already know, this year the EMOS webinar stream on Zoom. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on the EMOS YouTube channel, where you can already find the recording of the past webinars, as well as of the past two EMOS workshops, and also other relevant materials regarding the EMOS. Today, as a participant, you can watch and listen to the webinar. You can also use the Q&A manager to pose your question to the presenter during the webinar. Our speaker will be answering question during the webinar. We will have a break, and then at the end, the part of the final discussion. Should you have any technical problem or question, please send a message in the chat, and you will be contacted by one of the members of the technical staff. So today, I have the pleasure to host Dr. Oriol Bosch. Oriol is a methodologist with 7 years of experience researching on how to better collect and analyze attitudinal and behavioral data for the social sciences. He is specialized in survey methodology and the use of digital trace data. He has a strong statistical background that ranges from the generalized linear modeling to data science and computational methods. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science at the University of Oxford. And today he will present about measuring citizens' digital behaviors using web trackers and data donation. So Oriol, the floor now is yours until the question break.
Good. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation and for everyone that is joining. Let me share my presentation. So just a bit of housekeeping on how the webinar is going to work. Now I'm going to give you a bit of some context so we are all on the same page. Then a quick introduction on web tracking data and data donations. Then I'm going to dive deep into a guide of how to collect and use web tracking data. We're going to have a quick break in case you have any question about web tracking data. Then I will talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we might face when exploring and using web tracking data. And I will end with a quick version of a guide of how to collect data donations. So as you can see, it is more about web tracking than data donations, essentially because there is more research done to this date on how to use web tracking data in the errors and not on data donations. So diving into a bit of a context so we are all on the same page, I think that it comes to no one's surprise if I say that we use the internet a lot and we use our smartphones a lot, and that might have some consequences to ourselves and also the society that we live in. There has been a lot of talk on whether maybe social media and smartphones are harming our mental health, and especially the ones of teenagers. And for years, we have been talking about whether this pandemic of misinformation that we face online is partly responsible for the increasing polarization in Western democracies, and whether these might be a challenge to our democratic systems. But at the same time, the fact that we inhabit this very digitalized world means that a lot of our behaviors are constantly being tracked. And there's a lot of traces now available that tell us something about how humans behave. And this sometimes is scary, but also it's an incredible opportunity for researchers to understand better the human experience. So in this context, we can do the same that we have been doing for the last few decades, that it would be simply to go and ask people to self-report what they do online with surveys. But also there is this new opportunity that these digital traces allow us, that is, we can directly collect those to see what people do online without having to rely on what they tell us. In general, the most common way that you might have seen these digital trace data collected might have been through people directly getting this data from the platforms. This might mean using APIs that the platforms put and allow people to get data from, or scrapping the web with different technologies. That's what we would call found data. A good example is all of the research about Twitter data. So just researchers downloading a lot of tweets from a lot of users and then extracting some information and some conclusions from this. And this research is great, but it lacks some of the design component that we are used to in the social sciences. There's no control over the participants and the people that we're using for our research, and there is very little control on how this data is produced and collected. So for the past few years, there has been quite interest in developing approaches to collect digital traces with a design component that might resemble what we do with surveys. So this means designing a sample of people that we contact and ask to collect their digital traces in some way that allows us to make statistical inferences in a more robust and traditional way as we're used to as social scientists. Two potential and quite used approaches that have been used in these last few years are web tracking data and data donations. So maybe you know some of these approaches already, but just to refresh our minds, what is web tracking data? Web tracking data is any direct observation of online behaviors that we get through tracking solutions, or what in industry sometimes is called meters. So these meters are just a group of tracking technologies that can come in different packages, such as apps or plugins that people install on their browsers. And once the participants we recruited install these technologies in their devices, always willingly, we can start collecting the traces that they leave when they interact with their devices online. So this might mean we can start recording the URLs and the apps that they visit, and for how long they visit those, and even sometimes what they see and what they do within those webs and those apps. On the other hand, data donations require users to directly provide researchers with data that other companies and other devices have already collected from them. So when we use Facebook, when we use Twitter, when we use our device, they are recording some of our data for their own internal purposes. And we as users have the right to access this data, download it, and share it with researchers. So contrary to web tracking data, in this case, the process would look like a participant goes and accesses this data, captures it in some way, and shares it with the researcher. So as you can imagine, the process and the kind of traces that we can collect might vary a lot depending on the data donation project that we're looking at. And some of the platforms that you might consider that are quite easy to research with this approach could be all of the meta platforms with Facebook and Instagram, WhatsApp, Google, Twitter, etc. So now what we can do is talk a little bit more about how we can collect and use web tracking data in the best way possible. In order to talk about this, I use as a reference this total error framework for digital traces that we created with Melanie Revilla, my co-author. And you might know already the total survey error framework. And this is an adaptation that tries to mimic what has already been done for decades for surveys, which is very useful and convenient to these new sources of data. So the main logic behind all of this is that web tracking data is used in a very similar way as survey data. We want to measure a specific concept of interest, say the exposure of people to fake news, and we want to make inferences for a specific population. And in order to do this, we create specific measurement instruments, and we get these data from these instruments from a specific sample. The steps to follow in order to go from these concepts of interest in these populations that we care about and data that we collect are quite a lot, and they are quite hard. And many times it is rarely acknowledged and understood. So it is very important to improve the way that we use web tracking data by improving our understanding of how to follow these steps. One of the first steps that you have to do when you want to collect web tracking data from any population is to do the same that you do for surveys. Think, what is my target population? Say, the people living in the UK that is older than 17. How can I get a frame from which to get a sample from that population? And what sampling approach I will use to get that data? In general, however, the most common approach in the literature to get this data hasn't been following any probabilistic approach like the one that I suggested before, but to go and hire companies such as YouGov and NetQuest that already have non-probability online panels. So that are pools of thousands and thousands of individuals are willing to participate in surveys, and that at the same time have tracking technologies installed on their devices. On the other side, on the side of measurement, the first thing that anyone should do is think, what are the concepts that I want to measure? So exposure to fake news, consumption of news, exposure to harmful content. And then decide how the measurements that they will be used have to be operationalized. So how can we measure something that will tell us something about the concept of interest? In general, in surveys, this would look like a survey question. So we would design a specific wording and a specific scale that once asked to a person, we assume that tells us something about the concept that we want to measure. In web tracking research, this measurement would be the traces that we will collect, combine, sometimes even transform to compute a specific variable. And the problem in web tracking research so far is that this definition of the measurement is normally not clearly done. So think about the example that we want to measure the extent to which an individual encounters written news media. We would have to define a measurement that would look something like the average time that we record the visits of people to specific URLs that show written news. But when you start looking at the details on how to do this, things get a bit more tricky. So what are the traces that we will consider as a visit? Which URLs and what content within those URLs do we consider that is written news? And for how long do we have to track people to see something resembling a typical behavior, such an average? These decisions are very important and will determine the quality of the measures that we create. It's exactly the same that happens with surveys. It matters a lot how we design a survey question for the quality of what we'll end up getting. So it is important that when we do this, we follow good literature that tells us why we're doing what we're doing, that we tell the audience and our readers why we made these decisions and what decisions we made. Once we have a specific measurement designed, we will have to decide what technologies we're using in order to track people. We have several options to do this. One could be develop our own tracking technology from scratch. This might make sense in a big institution that has a project that will last for a long time, because it is very resource consuming, but probably not for a one-off project. For one-off projects, we have access to some open access technologies that are already available. There are not that many, and not all of them are great, but there's increasing work putting on that is very encouraging. I know that Gizes is working on a new tool that might be very promising in the future. But most researchers, essentially because they use online panels such as NetQuest or YouGov, end up using commercially available technologies provided by companies such as RealityMind or Wakupa. But they are very good, they have high quality, but the problem is that we don't have control over them, and we have to spend public money on getting these and getting a hold of these technologies. Something else to know about these technologies is sometimes we imagine just one app that people will install and will work everywhere and perfectly. But this is not the case. Tracking technologies can look very differently. We can use VPNs, proxies, screen scrappers, screen recorders, etc., etc., etc. So there are many technologies that fall within this name. And they also can look very differently on the side of the user. We can end up asking people to install an app or a plugin on their browser, or even sometimes to configure a proxy manually on their devices. So the user experience also fluctuates a lot. And the capabilities of these technologies also vary. Not all of them can be installed everywhere. Not all of them collect the same data or with the same accuracy. So the decisions that we make when collecting this data, when deciding which tracking technologies to use, is very important, and we should report them transparently. And in general, what it means is that more real life projects end up using a combination of approaches, because not all of them work in the same way for all of the devices that we might want to track. So once we have a sample and we have a group of technologies that we want to use, we need to ask those people to install the technologies on their devices. And this is potentially the most consequential decision and step that we will have to follow on a web tracking project, because it will determine who we are tracking and how well we're tracking them. So normally when we think about tracking people's behaviors, we think about getting information at the individual level. But actually, people use many different devices and browsers and networks when they go online. So our goal actually is to know what people do through all of the devices that they use to go online. And we can achieve this by tracking all of the devices that they use, or all of their browsers, or all of the information that they send through the servers that they have in their homes or in their works, or through potentially, most commonly, a combination of these things. But as we will see later, this is very complex, very prone to errors, and it can have very consequential implications to the quality of our data if we fail to do this properly. And more problematically, many times if you're using a panel company, this is out of your power. The panel company is the one that is recruiting people, is the one that is making sure that they track people on all of the devices. So the only thing that you can do is try to assess how well your sample is being tracked. Once we have a sample with trackers installed on their devices, they will start sending information into our data storage. And this information, in the most basic version, will look like something like this. We will have all of the actions that happened, all of the actions that happened when people went online recorded. So we will have something like a user ID, a timestamp, and what is the thing that happened. So for instance, what is the URL that someone visited, or what is the app that someone visited? So a very big, unstructured, messy data set. The data set can get even messier if we have a technology that allows us to collect richer information, such as HTML information. So we might have a technology that allows us to check, to get information of the text that people see on Facebook posts, or the number of likes of the posts that people see, or the comments that they put. So obviously then with this textual data, things get bigger and messier. And because this data set is so big and it's so messy, most social scientists will require to process this data set and create something more structured that can be used for traditional kind of analysis that we do. In order to do this, the first thing that we need to do is extract some of the data from this big data set. This might simply mean getting a subset of the raw data. It could be URLs from a given period or URLs that contain specific keywords. And we have a project right now in which we wanted to check whether people answering survey questions about political knowledge cheated. So we only had to extract URLs from the specific time periods that we knew that people were answering political knowledge questions. Another way of extracting information could be using queries that count the occurrence of something in the data set. So for instance, we could tell SQL, a program that or a language that is normally used for these big data sets, create a new variable that counts the number of occurrences for each user ID of URLs with the Google term, or count the number of times that names such as YouTube or Netflix, etc. occur. And then you create the variable that is structured, that is telling you how often for each person, for each given day, they visited Google or a news article or something like this. A second optional step is to transform this data that we have extracted. And this normally is required if what you want to use is not only simple counts of URLs, but something more complex. For instance, URLs can be enriched and we can get more information from them than simply counting the occurrence of some words. For instance, we can manually code the content of URLs. The Guardian puts every article that they post on different categories. And normally these categories mean the content of those articles. We can use that information to not only say, well, someone visited the Guardian, but to say what kind of information they read on there. We can also enrich URLs with information from external sources. There's researchers that have already given scores on the left to right to some news media outlets in the States. We could use that to compute the average ideology of participants' media diets. We can get something more complex if we have information about the headlines or the text or the images of the content that people are visiting. We could develop machine learning algorithms or reuse some that are already available to say something about what people see. For instance, instead of relying on what other people have done, we could use a machine learning algorithm that reads the text of all of the news articles that someone has visited and give them a score from more left to more right. And finally, we can use the information from URLs and the content to say something not about their behaviors, but about their attitudes or their opinions. We're currently working on a paper in which we use the articles and the news that people read to infer something about their ideology. And the final step is once you have this data, you can load it and store it in your device and conduct some analysis. And the good thing about web tracking data is that you can do this several times. You can extract data at any point, work on it, transform it, reload it. So your data set will always be evolving. This means that the pre-processing step compared to a survey is way harder and longer, but also that it is extremely flexible. And this can be an asset. In a survey, if you forgot to add one question, or if you thought that afterwards that maybe you would have had ask a question differently, you cannot go back in time and do this. With web tracking data, you can recreate variables as many times and in many different ways as you want to check how robust your analyses are or to improve the quality of your analysis. And finally, once we have a data set, you can start modeling and estimating whatever you wanted to do with the data. And this is pretty similar to what we do with surveys. We can add weights, we can add imputation, and then we can create estimates such as averages or regression coefficients or whatever you're interested in doing. So I think that is a good time to maybe break for some questions in case there is the need for any clarification about web tracking data, and if not, we will move to the next sections.
Don't see questions for the moment. So maybe we can go on because I asked you, but I think better at the end.
Okay, good. So we have talked about how we can collect web tracking data. Now we can discuss some of the potential challenges that we might face when collecting web tracking data. As I said, web tracking data is used in a very similar way as surveys. And luckily, this means that the same kind of errors might affect web tracking data. It means that the data that we collect might suffer from coverage errors if we didn't have a frame that covered all of the population, sampling errors, missing data errors. We can have specification errors, measurement errors, etc., etc. But the thing is, the causes behind these errors are different than what happens with surveys. So in this case, we don't have to worry about people misremembering what they did or having or behaving in systematic ways in the way that they answer our surveys. But we have a new bunch of new errors that we are not very ready to handle as social scientists. So for instance, when it comes to measurement errors, it might happen that we don't track everything, all of the devices that people use when they go online. Or it might happen that the technologies that we're using cannot collect things as accurately as we want. Or that when they are installed, something happens with our server or with the technology that stops data coming in. Or we extract the data in a badly way. Or maybe we're tracking a device that is used by more than one people, and we don't know that, and we end up tracking data from third-party actors that we didn't want to track. So all of these errors, I will not go deep into all of them, but I recommend you to read the paper that we wrote if you want to understand them a little bit better. But what I will do is I will focus on this specific one, tracking under coverage, because through our research, we have seen that is pretty problematic, but it can be dealt with. And everything that I will say is based on this paper that you can find online if you want. And I'm just giving a very tiny summary of what we found. So, as I said before, when we use web tracking data, what we want to is measure the behaviors of a specific individual. But the reality is that we only measure what we can manage to track. Sometimes we will be very lucky and successful, and we might track all of the devices and browsers and networks that people use when they go online. So we will observe exactly what someone did online. No errors there. But realistically, in many cases, we might only observe part of what people do, because several issues might mean that we track some of the devices, but not all of the ones that they use to go online. So this might mean that what we observe is not really the true behavior of someone. And this difference between the observed behavior and the true one is what we could consider a measurement error. Why might these happen? One potential reason is that we're using technologies that cannot track all of the devices and browsers that people use when they go online. This is a very common problem that people have. A lot of the research that has been conducted with web tracking data only tracks people on their computers because they don't have the capability to track mobile devices. Another reason is that even though this is digital data, we still need for people to comply with what we ask them to do. And if they use several devices, and we ask them to install different kinds of technologies, some of them very important, some in all of the devices that they use, they might say, hey, I want to participate in this study, but I will not do everything that you're asking me to because it's a bit too much. At some point, people might also decide to uninstall the technologies that they use because they take memory that they want to have, or because they interact in bad ways with their connectivity, or in the long run, they might start using new devices that we don't know of and they don't tell us about. In our research, we did a study in Spain, Italy, Portugal, Argentina, and Chile, so 5 different countries in 2 continents. And we tried to understand, okay, what is the prevalence of people not being tracked in all of the devices that they use when they go online. What we found is that in general, it is extremely prevalent. So most people that we surveyed did not have all of the devices that they used to go online fully tracked. So only 26% of them had everything, 74% had something missing. And we see something very obvious, that is, the more devices people use, the less likely it is that we track them on all of the devices. Also, we saw that there are some particular issues with the kind of devices that they use. So in the NetQuest panel, that is the one that we researched, we found that most of the Apple devices, so specifically iPhones, but also Macs, that people use were not being tracked. So this means that most of everything that the people do through their iPhones and their Macs is being lost because of the limitations of our technologies and how hard it is to track people with proxies in iPhones and Macs. And is this a big problem for our research? We did a simulation study testing what could be the bias introduced across different scenarios of more likely or less likely of having a computer or a mobile device untracked for different types of variables. And obviously, you don't need to fully understand this graph, but what it shows is that the relative bias is quite substantial in many of the scenarios and for many of the variables that we tested. So, for instance, an example of a realistic scenario that we explored with a realistic percentage of people having some of their computers and some of their mobile devices not tracked, we found that if we wanted to measure the proportion of people never reading news articles online, because of undercoverage, our estimate of this phenomenon went from 17%, that would be the real estimate, to 31%. So almost double the proportion of people that we found that never read online news. And if you look at this in terms of the time spent on the internet, it meant that we went from 221 minutes reading news to 157 minutes. So we lost around 70 minutes, more than an hour, of the behaviors that people did online. And now for the last bit of the talk, I will give you a bit of a guide on how to use data donations and what other things are important to consider. Just a refresher on what data donations are. A data donation is any instance in which a person accesses some of their personal data, captures it, and shares it with us, the researchers. Some other researchers have odd ideas and definitions of what the data donation are, normally more restrictive than mine, but I think that a data donation in other contexts and in other fields can mean broader things than what we might consider as methodologists. The process of collecting and analyzing data donations is pretty similar to the one of web tracking data, but it has three main important differences that are important to understand. The first, and potentially one of the main ones, is that in this case, we're not asking people to install any technology on their devices, so we don't have to develop or choose any technology. But what we have to do is we have to find and choose which data we will ask people to donate to us if we want to get the traces needed in order to fulfill the measurement that we design for the concepts of interest. So in this case, we will ask them to give us data from third parties that they can access to. And we will have to identify as a first step what data might be there available and whether this data is accessible or not. So we are constrained by what other companies have already created and collected. We don't have a control over what might exist or not, and we don't have a control over the format of that data or how that data has been created and processed before it gets to us. What kind of data can we collect in terms of digital behaviors through data donation? So what kind of data is already available? Digital devices such as smartphones or smartwatches or the fitness trackers already store and make available to users information about their device and battery and memory usage information. And normally these are provided as kind of outputs for individuals when they use their phones. If you go to your Android or your iOS device, probably you will have a well-being area that tells you exactly how you have been using your phone. If you have any fitness app, it will normally tell you how active you have been. If you have or it might tell you which places you have been. So all of this information is already available for you, and you could collect it and share it with researchers. But also, not only your devices collect information from you and make it available, but tech companies and online platforms that you might use also have these. So that means that we can have access to our browsing histories, our social media usage, location and travel data, and even advertisement data. And all of this data can be requested and then sent to whoever we want to send it for research purposes. Once we have identified that data that might be available to users that can be used for our measurements, instead of going and asking them to install a technology on their devices, we need to ask them to donate that data to us. And this is as important as the step of installing technologies to people's devices. It's very relevant because it will determine who we are getting data from and how good that data might end up being. So in most cases, when we ask someone to donate their data, that will require them to do three separate things. They will have to go and access that data, find that data that we're asking them to donate us, capture it in one potential way, and then come back to us and share it. So the goal from our side should be to make design decisions across these three dimensions that might minimize the effort of participants to share this data while allowing us to collect the necessary data. So in which ways can people capture and share their data? Things that have been done already in the literature to capture data is to ask people to take pictures or screenshots of their data. So for instance, go to your well-being screen in your smartphone and take a screenshot or several screenshots of that and send it to us, and then we can extract that information. A similar approach could be to take a video or a video recording. So instead of taking several screenshots, simply recording your screen for a while, and then we extract that information with computer vision algorithms. The potentially most common and most promising approach would be to ask people to download the information. So you can request Facebook or Google to give you all of the data that they have from you from the last several years, and then you can use that information, and once you get the data, send it to researchers. And also something that maybe most people would not consider as a data donation, but still I think that it might be, it's a bit of a stretch, is see that data, annotate it as it is, and then send it. And the way that this data can be shared will also vary depending on the project and the decisions that researchers do. So it can be uploaded within a questionnaire. Most modern softwares such as Qualtrics allow for the uploading of documents. It could be uploaded in an outside system like the one that we have developed in Oxford. It could be sent using an email, which probably is not recommended, and it's not even allowed by most ethical boards, or a secure sharing system. So that's completely outside of any system that has to be developed or a questionnaire. Or it can simply be manually reported in a questionnaire or in a form if they have annotated it, for instance. So as you can imagine already, the process to capture and share this data will vary a lot depending on the design decisions that someone has made. It's very different to ask a user within a questionnaire, hey, just leave now for a moment, go to your well-being center, take a screenshot, come back and upload it, than ask them to follow very complex instructions to go to Facebook, download data, wait for a few days, and then download it and come back again. That is what might normally happen when we're asking them to download data download packages. So to give you an example, this is some of the instructions that we developed in our project in Oxford for asking people to get their Facebook data and give it to us. And the graphics are beautiful, I would have to say, but as you can see, it's quite burdensome. They have to go to Facebook, find the part in the settings and privacy that talks about their account. There, they have to find how to request their data, fill in a bit of information, say what kind of data they want and in which format, submit that request. Then Facebook tells them it will be back to you in a few hours or in a few days. We will send you an email when it's ready. Once they get the email, they need to remember to go to Facebook, download the data, come back to our online platform, upload it in there, and then that's it. See, pretty easy. As you can see, it's a very burdensome process. But we might have to go through these burdensome processes because depending on the approach that we use to capture data, the amount of data that we might be able to collect and the privacy concerns of people might vary. So with the data download package of Facebook, you get all of the information that Facebook has ever collected from a person from years and years and years. If you only ask them to go and take a screenshot of something, there's that much data that you can collect with a screenshot. But maybe because they have more control over it, people will have less privacy concerns when they know that they are only giving a very small snapshot of their data instead of everything that a platform has ever collected from them. But even if I say that we as researchers have to make decisions in these different dimensions, sometimes we will not have this option because some of the data that we might be interested in can only be captured in one specific way. So for instance, the device usage data from your device most likely cannot be downloaded in any format that can be shared with people. That's why we need to rely on screenshots. And finally, in this case, because we're not using any tracking technology, we don't create any specific data. The data already has been collected in a specific format and is simply sent to us in that way. But that means that there might be a lot of data and a lot of information in that data set that we don't really want to have and that ethically we shouldn't have. And that means that a specific step of data donations that is very important, that probably is required by GDPR, is to do some data minimization. So the data that they might send us will be plagued with sensitive information and with a lot of information that we don't need. That might mean that if you ask people to donate their Google data because you want to know their browsing history, you might end up also collecting information about where they live in. You might even get information about every voice command that they have done with their phone. So you will have biometric information about their voice. You might have pictures of their family, etc., etc., etc. So all of these things need to be deleted. And this might happen locally. So in the same device of people, before any data comes to your server, you might create a Python script that extracts only the information from the download package that you want and then sends it to your server. Or you might ask people to send you everything and then have some specific script going in between the web page and your server that scraps all of that information and saves it. But that's something that is really important to have. You cannot have a data donation project without this kind of data minimization. And it might probably imply that you need to develop very complex coding that as social scientists, many times we don't know how to do. So you might have to partner with computer scientists and maybe even a legal expert that tells you what you can and cannot collect. And that's all from my side. I think that if you have any questions or you want any clarifications or you want to discuss something in more detail, now would be a good moment.
Yes, we received a question about privacy, which then you actually already say something. So the question is, in your experience, how big is the fear about privacy in the potential participants? And that was also one of my questions. So are we ready for this? So you usually think that people are willing to participate, or still there are some fears? And yes.
Well, yeah, I think that's every time that I talk about any of these issues. By the way, do you want me to stop sharing?
Oh yeah, as you prefer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always a comment that we get, that what are the privacy issues and are people ready for this? I would say I think that people are more ready than what we assume that they are, because at least when you think about these online companies that we use, NetQuest or YouGov, we have a lot of people that really love to participate in these studies, and that they don't really necessarily care about their data being tracked because they know they have a relationship with the company that have been developed for many years, and they trust it. For one-off projects that you contact people from for the first time and they don't know anything about you, probably these things are very sensitive, and that would explain why participation rates are so low, apart from the fact that it's very burdensome. And that's why some people have said that maybe data donations are a better approach to engage people, because the logic there is a bit different. You're not creating any new data. This data is already held by someone, and those someones are not necessarily neutral actors, and you don't know what they do with it. So in this case, with data donations, you're asking people to allow you to repurpose that data. Obviously, they still need to believe that you will do a good work with their data and nothing will go wrongly. And that's why you have to do a lot of work into convincing them that you have these systems and mechanisms in place that make sure that you only collect unidentifiable data that is secure in your systems. but we haven't tested yet whether they really believe in that and whether that really increases people's willingness to participate.
Okay, thank you. And then there is another question that is also linked to my another question. So do you know if this is used in the content of official statistics? Because, yeah, for what I know, of course, you started from this idea. Now, suppose that your target is a large population, like living in a country, Italy, or maybe in a smaller region. So one possibility, and I think that in Italy, this was considered by our National Statistical Institute, you could use the sample that is already raw and then ask people in the sample to install the apps and so on. Because my main question is also linked to this, is if in any case people allow this data donation or so on, you usually never have any demographic characteristic of them. Suppose that you want to understand which part of the population you are covering, or yes, maybe with the apps, I mean, also how you collect the information, you can also ask like the gender at least, or some age class, because I guess that is also very, I mean, older people, maybe you are not covering them so much, I don't know, even if this problem is reducing maybe. So I think this is relevant for the official statistic especially.
Yeah. The good thing about data donations and web tracking data is they are easily linkable to any survey that you might want to send them. So in general, they are always used alongside with surveys. It's true that most of these projects will always face the challenge of having low response rates and potentially being affected by a lot of representation issues. And I think another challenge for already well-established panels or infrastructures is that they might be worried of the impact that these might have on their attrition and the relationship that they might have with the panelists or the participants of those studies. But it's true that there are a few attempts that have been done, not necessarily with web tracking data or data donations, but as long as I know, in the Netherlands, they have a few projects in which they have people tracked with GPS, which is also very invasive. And I know that in Gises, they are building a panel that probably is going to be a mix of probabilistic and non-probabilistic that are going to be tracked, and they're going to be asked to donate their data. So I think that efforts need to be made, because the alternative, if not, is that as researchers using public money, we just use that money to give it to private companies, when we could be using that money to build infrastructures that actually allow us to access that data in a more cost-effective way.
Yeah, I agree. So there's another question. Are there platforms like X or Facebook that allow researchers to collect data for free directly from the platform and not from the users? This data could be used as supporting information in some studies. I heard about Twitter data for academic research, but I think it's no longer available. Thank you. So do you have an idea about that? So
yeah, that's one of the reasons why I think that some researchers now are starting to shift to data donations, for instance, is that before, years ago, it was easier to get a hold of this kind of data. Facebook had an open API, so there was a lot of research done with Facebook data. Twitter, now X, used to have an academic API, and now they change, and it's not clear. It seems that now you have to pay, or maybe you can request, but as long as I know, no one has gotten access to that for free anymore. I think that Reddit has an API that might still be public, but they were also talking about putting some sort of charge in there. So it seems that the web is getting closer, and it's getting close to researchers. So we have to find another way of getting that kind of data, and data donations might be an approach that is ethical and cost effective.
Okay, thank you. And then there is another question. Maybe instead of collecting the data, the use of some privacy enhancing technologies to process the data in some distributed, secure way and collect only the final result would help to increase the donation rate and compliance the GDPR. What is your opinion on that? There is also an example about this. Oh, like trusted smart surveys, a possible application of privacy enhancing technology. So I think this is related to official statistics. So I think it depends on if you are aware of this or not.
I don't know if it's the same of, so everyone is developing these things in different ways. In the group of researchers in Utrecht and Amsterdam that are working on this, their framework for collecting data donations is people donate, people have the data download package, then they put it on the system, and inside their own device, that data is cleaned, and then they see what is the data that they will send. So maybe you can define as a researcher that you only want to know their travel history for the last month, and that's it. That's the only thing that you will get from Google. So there's a script that works on their computer that gets only that data, and then it shows it to people and says like, hey, you're gonna donate this. Are you willing to donate only this? And then that's the only thing that gets to our servers. And that should potentially help make people trust the system a bit more. And it's obviously GDPR compliant.
Okay. I maybe can anticipate another question that I think is linked, because the question is, usually respondents should be informed on the final aim of the survey. Of course, potentially the data then are donated could be used for different aims. How do you deal with it?
Yeah. So for instance, this is the case of what we're doing in Oxford. What we're doing in Oxford is different. It's an infrastructure that has the aim of being reused a lot in unexpected ways. So that means that what we disclose to people is different than in a normal survey, which you say, hey, you're participating to this specific study and we will use the data in this specific way. You're telling people you're donating this data that will be used in these ways. So it will be used for academic purposes, not for profit. You will always have the ability to withdraw from any study. You will always have the ability to delete that data from the server. But the moment that you give it to us, we might use it for many other studies. And that's GDPR compliant, and that is legal. And as far as I know, the people working on that spent even more than a year with lawyers and with the European Research Council finding a way of how to make it work. But you can actually do that. It's just that it needs to be properly disclosed, and people need to always, in a way, you are simply you have the right to use their data, but their data will always be theirs. So they always have to have the right to take the data out of the system.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, and that maybe last question, have you tried to assess what is the bias from the fact who volunteers to participate? It is likely that online behaviors of people who are linked to be tracked donate data differ from those who don't.
Yeah. There's less research about that, essentially because it's there's very little research that has been done with probabilistic approaches. So that's the one that normally would allow you to see how the people that you're tracking and the people that you're not tracking differ. But I think that the few research that exists, it does say, yes, we have a group of people that are more online and that consume more news than others and things like that. But it's truly something that needs to be explored in the future with the new approaches. The new studies that are going to be conducted with probabilistic approaches. They will be able to explore these. It's not something that is very easily done with non-probability samples.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe that's the idea. If you could have a probability sample and ask those people to install the app, then you could also estimate something about that.
But that's something that is going to come, because I know, as I said, for instance, in Gises, they are building a new infrastructure. So I think that that's a lot of the work that they are going to do is going to be about, wait, how representative this might be.
Yeah. And actually, since I think we're coming to the end, so before, just to say that our next webinar will be deal also with this. It will be about smart surveys and also the link of people statistics. So that's nice that we have the possibility to further discuss this.
Yeah.
So
I would say, oh wait, can I add something?
Yeah.
Okay, and just because I finished before, but if anyone had any, I don't know, if anyone is very interested on these, this presentation was very condensed and quite rushed, because it's actually just a reduced version of a course that I give. If anyone is interested about this, apart from sending me an email, if they have any questions or want to collaborate on anything, I will be giving a 9-hour course in Barcelona in mid-March. So anyone can check that and try to register. I think that there's like cheaper rates for students, and that's my shameless self-promotion. But but I would say go to the next one, because Peter Luptik is amazing.
Okay, no, thank you, because of course we only had 1 hour, but it's good that, especially for our students, they know how to reach you if they have specific questions. So now, unfortunately, it's time to close. So thank you, Oriol, for this very interesting presentation. Many thanks also to all our participants who joined us today. As participants, you are invited to fill in a short survey about today's webinar. The webinar will open your browser just after the end of this Zoom meeting. If you don't have time right now, you will receive a link by email to fill in the survey later on. We really appreciate your feedback to further improve our webinars. So as I was mentioning, our next webinar will be about smart surveys. The presenter will be Peter Luptik from Utrecht University. He is a member of the IMOS network. And this webinar is scheduled on February the 14th. So I hope that you will join us for this new webinar. For this and also for our future webinars, please keep an eye for our website, imos-events.com. So thank you again, Oriol. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice evening. Bye.
Bye.